Greetings, friends, and welcome to Contemplative Light in our world. And we have a very prestigious guest today. I think you will like this interview very much. And before I get to that, I wanted to give a heads up to all of our listeners that both myself and the executive director have books out. My book is called Preparation for Great Light by Clint Sabom, and it's on Amazon, and it's about 6 months I spent living in a silent monastery. And Mark Thomas Shaw's book is called Dante's Road, which won the prestigious Nautilus Book Award that previous winners Deepak Chopra and Marianne Williamson had gotten. So you might want to check out Dante's Road by Mark Thomas Shaw. And with all that said, I'd like to introduce our fantastic guest today, Dale. Welcome, Dale.
Thank you.
Yeah, glad to hear, glad to have you here. And I was wondering, for viewers that may not be familiar with your work, could you tell us maybe a little bit about yourself and your work?
Okay, maybe I can start by telling people my whole name.
Yeah,
So my name is Dale Borglum. I'm the director of the Living Dying Project. We have the most complete website on the internet about conscious dying, livingdying.org, all one word, Living Dying. And the Living Dying Project is a organization that Ram Dass, Stephen Levine, and I started a long, long time ago, and was really the beginning of the conscious dying movement here in the West. And by conscious dying, really all we mean is applying the wisdom of the traditional contemplative traditions to the encounter with end-of-life issues, dying, grieving, caregiving, etc.
fantastic. And could you give us maybe a little bit of a walkthrough of how that happens with someone who wants to experience conscious dying and facing death fearlessly?
Well, of course, it's incredibly individual. It's hard to generalize and say, here's what's going to happen to you, or here's what's going to happen to your friend. But my experience is that even when we're offering spiritual support for the dying, most people come to us having a lot of emotional issues that are in some way in the way of spiritual surrender, fear of death, guilt, shame. I'm a recovering mathematician. I used to be a mathematician, and my mathematical equation is that all fear is essentially fear of death, and that fear of death is lack of enlightenment. So that any place that you and I are lost in the delusion of separateness, there's going to be fear of death. So that where we're afraid is a remarkably accurate pointing at what spiritual work still needs to be done. So the fact that I'm doing this work with conscious dying is not so much that I'm Mother Teresa in drag or that I'm really interested in death per se. I want to awaken. And one of my first meditation teachers, Trungpa Rinpoche, said that until one comes into intimate contact with death, your spiritual practice will have the quality of you being a dilettante. So that until we know in our bones, until we know that you're going to die, but you don't know when, we can meditate till our knees fall off, and it'll develop calmness and a better personality. Maybe we'll make a little more money and have a better quality of sexual partner or whatever it is that you're looking for in life. But until you really know you're going to die, the deeper fruit of practice this dying into the next moment with love is not going to be available. So that we're just beginning this podcast. We'll be talking for another half hour, 3/4 of an hour, whatever it's going to be. And we don't really know that we're going to survive the podcast. The odds are high that we will, right? I'm probably a lot older than you. I'm in very good health, but I really try to remember that I don't know how long I'm going to be alive. That this is probably the only time I'm ever going to have a chance to interact with you and with a lot of people in the audience, right? So that am I getting all lost in what am I going to say? Am I trying to impress people? Am I trying to do this or do that? Or how much of it is, okay, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be alive. How much can I surrender into my heart? How loving can I be? How much can I trust that God and my relationship with God is unfolding moment to moment? That there's this sense of radical surrender, the sense of devotion to that which is. And certainly one can work with those qualities without thinking about death. But to me, having this added motivation or this fundamental truth that we're going to die and we don't know when is a great inspiration to deepen one's practice. So when somebody comes to work with me, somebody that often has a diagnosis of advanced cancer, the first thing to look at is what is the motivation? How deeply does this person want to awaken? And usually for everybody, not just people who might be approaching death, people who are entering spiritual practice, deepening spiritual practice, have a mixed motivation. On one hand, you want to be free. On the other hand, you want it not to hurt too much along the way, right? You want to be happy. And those two motivations are going to come into conflict. And so the question is how much is that person willing to look at what it is that is blocking them from dying into this next moment to surrendering into love? When I first started doing this work, I felt that my job was to rescue people, to pull them out of the jaws of unconscious dying and lift them over to this other track of conscious dying. And the more I've done this work, I've realized a couple things that firstly, sometimes people need to suffer more. That the very first step in the 12 steps, and I'm not a really big 12-step person, but the very first step says, I've realized that my life is out of control and I need to turn it over to a higher power because I'm not doing a very good job myself. And until somebody gets to that stage, to that realization, then not much healing is going to happen. So if I try to protect somebody or fluff them up when they're not really ready to do the work, it's actually slowing the process down. Cancer does not cause suffering. Dying does not cause suffering. Resistance to cancer, resistance to dying causes suffering. And until we know what the cause of suffering is, it's going to be very difficult to work with it. So that's the first point. And then the second point I'd like to make is that as this work has proceeded, I realize that it's about healing. It's not about dying. It's about helping somebody heal. And maybe the healing is into death. Maybe the healing is into physical curing and getting better. I don't know. That's not up to me. It's not even up to the patient or the client. It's up to God. It's up to karma. It's up to the universe, if you will. So that all I can do is help somebody have a more conscious, holistic, in the larger sense of the word, relationship with what's going on. And then that wholeness will evolve into what it's going to evolve into. Ramakrishna and Ramana Maharshi both died of cancer. I don't think they had cancer-prone personality structures, right? Everybody's going to die eventually. So that if death is the enemy and we're trying to use spiritual practice to push death away, then good luck, right? I mean, it's going to be, there's this concept of spiritual bypassing, right? Can we use spiritual practice to avoid the suffering that we're going through right now? So that I find that being around dying people, whether in person or via Zoom, I've got clients all over the world. And I was just talking to a guy in Berlin right before I got on the Zoom here with you, that until we really know we're dying, until we can really let go of death is the enemy, I've got to fix this, but be in a much more moment to moment surrender, then spiritual practice is just, as the lovely poem by Kabir says, fluffing the pillows and arranging the bedding, right? Right? Can we really dive into this work?
Well, fantastic. A lot of that resonates with my own take too, and my own intuition and perspective. I'm wondering, with the spiritual bypassing of spiritual work, I mean, I guess the work you're doing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is all kind of a death meditation. Do you ever recommend like a specific death meditation of imagining yourself dead? I've heard that some teachers have offered that.
Yeah, I don't do that so much. My dear friend Stephen Levine has a book called One Year to Live or A Year to Live, something like that. And the whole book takes you through a journey of a year long. You just got a diagnosis that you've got a year to live. And then you're going to the doctor and you're imagining your own funeral and your own dying and the whole thing. And uh, so I really can't say that I've done much of that on my own. To me, I'm often working with people at the very, very end of life. So we don't really have to imagine their death. It's actually happening. It's just like, they're so close to the end of their life that the body is deteriorating, the ability to be energetic is deteriorating. I remember once I had a client who was dying pretty slowly of an inoperable throat and neck cancer. He was basically being strangled by his tumors. And he said, I used to really love playing basketball, but now I can't play basketball anymore. I used to really love eating chili rellenos. This was in New Mexico, but I can't eat chili rellenos anymore. I used to really enjoy being able to go to the bathroom by myself without having anybody help me. I can't do that anymore. But I feel like I'm being whittled away to my essential self. As I'm losing these abilities one after the other, what remains is this part of me that is essential, that is not going to die. And as he said this, he was glowing. He was very, very happy, even though when he said that, he didn't have much longer to live. So, in some strange way, the most beautiful Americans I've ever been around, with very few exceptions, are people who are almost dead because they're willing to be who they are. They're not thinking, if I had more money, if I were better looking, if only Donald Trump did this or didn't do that, or whatever the fantasy is, right? But that this just the way it is perfect. That this is enough. That I've had the great blessing to be around some of the greatest spiritual masters, meditation teachers of the late 20th century. And what my experience was that all of these enlightened beings, when I was around them, it was clear that they saw how neurotic I was and how I saw myself as limited. and they saw and related to the part of myself that was whole and unlimited and perfect. And the more I was around them, the more I believed it, right? So that I still have a quirky personality. I'm still a kind of a complicated person in some ways. And yet I don't really care about that so much anymore. Ram Dass had this really great quote. He said, if you're a son of a bitch and you get enlightened, you'll be an enlightened son of a bitch. Right. And so it's not about fixing the personality. I mean, clearly we have to do enough psychological work that the psychological stuff isn't a big drag on spiritual practice all the time. But we're never going to be perfect psychologically. We're never going to be Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was not Mother Teresa, by the way, right? But so you have these qualities. You still get angry sometimes. You still get this emotion, that emotion, but you're not identified with it. It's just like in English, we say, I am afraid. In Spanish, people say, yo tengo miedo, I have fear. In Tibetan, they say, fear is here. So it's just in the way we think, language, speak in English, it's so much more difficult not to get identified with the passing mind-body state. Emotions are coming and going. They're not good or bad. They're all healing messages. And it's rare that I'm at the bedside of somebody who's dying and it's like this perfect dying where the angels are playing their harps and everybody's singing Kumbaya, and it's this wonderful thing that there's medical stuff going on, there's personality stuff going on, and how much are people being lost in that? Right now, how much are we being lost in, as you called me, the prestigious guest? How much am I how much am I identified with prestigious Dale? I mean, it's the first time I've ever been introduced as Dale. I always thought I had a last name, but maybe prestigious Dale is good enough. But how much am I lost in that, right? And how much is it just the words are coming out and the listening is happening, the speaking is happening? We're trusting, we're dying into the next moment that the practice is the goal. There's this lovely, lovely line by Rumi where in this particular poem called Love Dogs, there's this guy who had prayed a lot and reached out to God a lot, and he never got a response. And he was complaining to God, hey, how come you're not responding to me? And God said, the longing you express is the return message. The grief you cry out from is the secret cup, right? So it's to expect that it's going to come back in a certain way. No, it's just the fact that we are longing, the fact that we are reaching out. That is the answer.
Now, I'm curious with the people you do work with all of this, do you ever offer them a picture of the afterlife, such as reincarnation or a transitioning time between worlds and incarnations? Do you ever offer them something like that, or is the idea more to face the great unknown?
Well, sometimes people, I mean, I do have a 10-minute lecture. Here's what happens after you die. But I don't find that very interesting. I mean, uh, I guess fundamentally, I think it's very useful to believe or to realize that consciousness survives death. I have a very strong belief that something survives death, right? It's not when you're dead, that's it. But whether it's heaven and hell or reincarnation or Shirley MacLaine or God knows what, uh, I try to be very practical. What information can I use, can I share that allows me and the people around me to be more present now? Because I really believe that the way we live determines how we will die, and how we will die is going to determine what happens next. So we can sit around. I mean, somebody asked the Buddha, does reincarnation exist? And he said to this man, he said, well, suppose reincarnation existed. How would you live your life? And the man thought about it. He said, well, because I'd want to get a really good next birth, I would really study the scriptures a lot and meditate a lot and be an all-around nice person. And then the Buddha said, well, suppose reincarnation didn't exist. And the man thought about it and he said, well, because this would be my only chance, I'd really study the scriptures and meditate a lot and be an all-around nice guy. And the Buddha said, just so, it doesn't really make any difference. It's where you're getting lost in conceptualizing here and trying to guess what's going to happen next. It's just taking you out of the present in a certain way.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of this poem by Walt Whitman. I think it was in When Lilacs Last in Dooryard Bloomed, and it was about the death of President Lincoln, I believe, if I'm getting this right. And then he kind of serenaded death in his own way, kind of as if for himself. And when he talked about it, he said, "Oh, great death, and when thou must come, come unfalteringly." And I was always impressed by that just fear and complete willingness to die. And I think that's so hard for so many people to get.
Yeah. Well, we live in a society that really denies, tries to avoid, push away sickness, old age, and death. And those qualities tend to be isolated, to be pushed away. In more indigenous societies and more traditional societies, that isn't the case. And so I run this outfit called the Living Dying Project. I mentioned the website at the beginning of the podcast. We have a program. There's an online training program somebody can take, and then they can become a Living Dying Project volunteer. And we match them up with people who are dying. So essentially, we're matching meditators with dying people for their mutual benefit, as much for the volunteers for the client. And the more one is familiar with death, and it's not this mysterious boogeyman, but a very natural process. To me, that tends to demystify it, to allow one to be in a more intimate relationship with it. And as I said before, all fear is fear of death. Working with fear of death is one of the most fundamental transformative practices, spiritual practices that one can do. Fear of the spacious nature of the heart, fear of the impermanent nature of reality, fear of death. Can we be with that quality of fear? And for most people, it's very difficult to be with fear, that as soon as fear arises, the impulse that has so much momentum behind it is to fixate on the trigger. I'm afraid Trump is going to get elected. I'm afraid Trump isn't going to get elected. I'm afraid of this. I'm afraid of that. Rather than what does it actually feel like to be afraid? And what does it feel like in your body? Let go of the narrative. Okay, the fear is here right now. What does it feel like in your belly? What does it feel like in your chest? Can you really be with those sensations? And then even beyond that, can you feel compassion for the part of you that's afraid? Can you very gently lean into the fear rather than automatically recoil and try to get away from it? Healing happens through contact. It doesn't happen by thinking about something. It happens by meeting it with intimacy and with mercy.
Wow. Wow. Yes. Yes. It does kind of resonate, that fully feeling the feeling of fear would kind of help release it more. And the more you could sit in it, the more you would be perhaps accepting it, and by accepting it, releasing it. You know, one thing this makes me think of, and I don't know if this is tangential to what we're talking about, is one of the early psychoanalysts, a student of Freud, Otto Rank, put kind of, and this would probably be for people who don't have a serious diagnosis, maybe earlier in life or something. He put a duality between the fear of life and the fear of death. And he actually found, or came to the conclusion anyway, that most people were afraid of life more than death. I was wondering your thoughts on that, if that makes sense.
Uh, well, that's interesting because there is this book called The Denial of Death by Becker, and he talks in that book largely about Rankian psychoanalytic thought. And he says kind of the opposite thing in that book, I thought, where he said that people have this anxiety about death, so they pull back from life, but life itself reveals the fear of death, so that people are actually in trying to get away from fear of death, are actually getting away from uh, life itself. Uh, Once again, I'm reluctant to go too far down an intellectual path here. I don't know how much different fear of life and fear of death are. I mean, for instance, people often say to me, I have an easy time feeling compassion for others. I have a hard time feeling compassion for myself. And I think that that's a mistaken impression. I don't think you can be truly more compassionate for anybody than you can be for yourself. It's just that, for instance, we tend to know ourselves better than we know other people. We know how narcissistic and cowardly and aggressive and all other kinds of qualities we are, and other people are presenting a personality that helps them survive, if you will. So when you are dying, all the fears of life are going to be there. I certainly think that fear of the concept of death and fear of the concept of life are two very different things. But that actual fear of death is pretty much the same as actual fear of life. The New York Times did a survey. What are you most afraid of? Number one was speaking in public. Number three was dying. But the part of you or I that is afraid of speaking in public is going to be there when you're dying. That's still part of the ego structure. And to the extent we're still identified with these contractions, that's going to make it that much more difficult to surrender into the light that is our true nature. The Tibetans say there's this light that appears when you're dying that's as bright as 1,000 suns. That's very, very, very bright, right? 1,000 suns. And so to the extent that you're pushing away fear of death, I mean, I'm sorry, that fear of speaking in public, that's going to be there as you're dying. That's going to make it harder to surrender. When you are dying, Donald Trump is going to be at your bedside looking over you, right? And maybe you love him, maybe you hate him. But the place in you that's unconsciously relating to Donald Trump, that he's not a human being, he's this meme, he's this metaphor in your life, if you will, that's going to be there. That's going to be how you're breathing. It's going to be how you're letting go of the body at the end. So that in a way, each moment is preparation for dying. Each time we breathe out, as we let go of breath, it's a small dying. And each time we breathe in, it's a rebirth. And if you really pay careful enough attention, it's difficult. It's very difficult to breathe freely, to not get the ego and the ego involved in breathing, in the sense that very often when we're breathing out, we don't let it go completely because it's a small death. And we don't let the in-breath happen naturally, all by itself. We grab at it subtly to affirm life, if you will. So that to me, fear of life, fear of death, it's really it's it's not a conceptual thing. It's a moment to moment thing of surrendering into the next moment, having no idea what's going to happen next. There's this kind of joke: if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans.
Of course, right, right. Life is what happens when we're busy making plans. I'm curious. You've given a whole lot of great stuff for our listeners and viewers, I believe, and this is good for everybody to hear. And I hope everybody integrates it into their day-to-day mindfulness, because I think it can be very, very helpful. It seems at any stage of life, because we don't know if we're going to make it through the podcast and still be alive, although the odds are high. I'm feeling pretty good about it, but
particularly since we're over half done, right? So
yeah. We're kind of getting to the end here,
we're
and
still
so
alive.
I think we're gonna make it, but yeah, who knows about afterwards. So I'm curious your experience of Ram Dass and being around him. What he is so looked up to. Yeah,
Right.
I'm almost wondering, how that was, if you're willing to share.
Well, I lived with Ram Dass. I traveled with Ram Dass. I was the executive director of his Hanuman Foundation. Uh, I so yeah, here we are talking about the dead. It's always a little tricky. Uh, Ram Dass was a human being who had some remarkable gifts. He was incredibly intelligent and open and was able to explain and express the Dharma, particularly for beginners, in a way that was unique, that almost nobody else could really talk about the nuance, the depth of Eastern mysticism and Western mysticism and make it accessible to somebody right in off the street. At the same time, he was a guy with his own neuroses. Uh, I remember once I was living with him in outside of Santa Cruz, California, and there was Ram Dass, whose name is Richard Alpert, my other friend Richard Johnson, and I. The three of us were sharing this house. In fact, Richard Johnson had a bumper sticker that said, "So few, so few Richards, so many dicks." But anyway, that's another story, I guess. But anyway, the three of us were going to have a holiday party. It was around Christmas, Hanukkah time, and we had this party, open house. All these people were there. Ram Dass had to come late. He had some other appointment. It was this great party. And then Ram Dass showed up, and the whole party, everybody who were guests were all of a sudden they were aware that Ram Dass was in the room. And everybody got self-conscious, and the whole party went to shit. It stopped being a fun party because Ram Dass was in the room. So in a way, being Ram Dass was a little bit lonely for him in a lot of ways. People projected a lot onto him. He was a teacher that changed the lives of so many people, both through his work with psychedelics and then his work with Eastern spirituality, mixed in with psychology. And tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people's lives were changed by the things that he did, for the better mostly. At the same time, I remember once he called me up and asked for relationship advice, which I thought was pretty weird because neither one of us had been particularly successful in that realm at that point. But and the other thing about Ram Dass was that he really was incredibly committed to his practice to the Dharma. That through all the ups and downs, through going to India, and the things we did together here in America, that he was always deeply focused on awakening, on what can he do to awaken and to help other people awaken. He was very generous in that way, that he would really go to great lengths to help people who were reaching out to him. And he had such deep love for our Guru Maharaji, for God, in a way that was very inspiring. So what I'm saying is, just like you and me, he was a twofold being. He was this deeply spiritual being, and he was a human being, right? That all of us, there's one side of us that's infinite, spiritual, sacred, another side that's finite, relative, human. And his human side was really beautiful, but it had a bunch of neurosis. But then there was the spiritual side. And I guess I'm mixing up the metaphors a bit. What I was trying to say was that the human side had two sides, that the human side was really remarkable. And he was just a human being at the same time. It was like both of those things. He changed my life. I met him when I was a graduate student at Stanford studying mathematics. And I got my PhD, followed him to India, and was never a mathematician, right? Ended up doing what I'm doing now instead. I met Maharaji because I went there to India with him. And since coming back, I've given my life to service, to working with dying people for the last 45 years.
Awesome. That's fascinating stuff, and it's very good to hear. And yeah, I think it's interesting with the party and people getting self-conscious. I think putting anybody on a pedestal can kind of do that to you, so but fantastic stuff. We've covered a whole lot of fantastic ground in this interview. I guess before we kind of wrap it up, there's some other things you want to say or some other things you want to plug?
Uh, well, once again, let me just say that the Living Dying Project has the most complete website on the internet about conscious dying. There's a lot of free material there, lectures, meditations, courses. There's a few things behind a paywall, but most of it's free. www.livingdying.org. I have a free every other Saturday spiritual support Zoom group that has over 1,000 people in it. They don't all show up because they're scattered all around the world. So Saturday morning in California is the middle of the night in Australia, for example, but everybody gets the recording. So there's that free group. We have support groups for people who are dying, for people who are caregivers, for people who are grieving, free support groups. We have a training program if somebody would like to be a project volunteer. Once again, I think that really the deepest, most auspicious spiritual practice for the strange age in which we're living now is an inner contemplative practice combined with an outer relationship with death. I know people who are working on the front lines of healthcare and they don't have an inner practice. They're getting burned out. I know people who are really diving into meditation, but they don't really have a relationship with death. And it's easy to let the practice be kind of superficial. Bringing these two things together is a very wonderful, auspicious, transformative practice.
Fantastic.
And I'm sorry to, and I also have a podcast. I just reminded myself I have a podcast too. It's on the Be Here Now Network, BeHereNowNetwork.com. And it's under my spiritual name, RamDev, RamDev. That's the name Maharaji gave me, RamDev Dale Borglum. The whole name is there, I guess. So I think there's about 110 episodes now, or 105, I forget exactly. We've talked about compassion and tantra and dying and meditation and grace and service and prayer and 105 topics there. So I'm not going to mention all of them, obviously.
Great stuff. Great stuff. I'll may end up checking it all out myself. And I did look through your website. Looks fantastic. So I think that's a great resource for people. And I mean, just so many blessings. And thank you for being, on this episode and joining me today.
Thank you, Clint, for having me. It's been a real pleasure to meet you.
Likewise.